We are just a few weeks removed from that SolarWinds hack and what we learned from it that implicated sector upon sector and prompted hearing in Congress from some of the top leaders in cybersecurity. And through all of that, we learned that a lot of the systems set up in place do seem to be getting attacked more frequently, as well as some of the stopgaps there maybe not being as secure as people once thought. And a new survey out there looking at just how much cyber criminals are making through these attacks. Very interesting to see a near tripling of the ransoms being paid, according to Palo Alto Network's Threat Intelligence Unit 42. Nearly 200 researchers on that team looking into it and saying the average ransom paid increased from just over $115,000 per attack in 2019 to more than $312,000 in 2020. Pretty shocking numbers when you think about how much money is coming from these attacks. And for more on that, I want to bring on our next guest, Wendi Whitmore, is Palo Alto Network's Senior Vice President, Cyber Consulting and Threat Intelligence. And she was part of the researchers behind this report. And Wendi, I mean, when we look at it, it's a lot of money, but what are we learning about these attacks and kind of how intricate they're becoming if they are indeed leading to some bigger payouts?
Absolutely. I think the reality is ransomware is no longer a nuisance, especially in 2020. It's become increasingly big business. So what we've seen that's contributed to these dramatic increase in numbers is ultimately an increase in sophistication and discipline. While some of us might have taken over a new exercise routine in 2020, ransomware operators actually took on and evolved an entirely new business model, which is much more sophisticated. It is much more like the enterprises that we see on a daily basis in the business world.
Wendi, what's interesting about your report is when you look at the number of attacks broken down by sector, it really goes to the heart of what we have seen throughout the pandemic. The healthcare sector, as well as the education sector, getting hit hard. Specifically as it relates to healthcare, what kind of attacks have we seen? Is it about going after the data in the research, the data in hospitals? Break that down for us.
Yeah, great question. So we see hospitals and healthcare in particular representing over 20% of the total attacks. And in 2020 in particular, that was an incredibly challenging time because we're in the middle of the pandemic and what we see are systems going offline. And ultimately that impacting human life in some cases where ultimately hospitals were not able to service patients. They had critical systems going offline because of these ransomware attacks. Shifting to the education discussion, as students were trying to get educated through remote learning, we saw attacks be, perpetuated against those very systems. So the ransomware operators in large part are looking to cause disruption, and that contributes to their business model of ultimately getting paid more money.
When it comes to kind of how these attacks are playing out, it was interesting to see kind of how long the SolarWinds hack was supposedly in preparation for. A lot of time went into planning something like that. How sophisticated are these teams now getting? And to me, as an outsider, it doesn't necessarily seem that surprising if the pay for these attacks is going up, that you would put more man hours into developing this. I mean, what's the right way to build defenses when it comes to cybersecurity for companies trying to protect themselves?
Yeah, so, as you mentioned, right, the average ransom that we saw paid this year was over $312,000, and the highest demand we saw was $30 million. So ultimately, these, ransomware operators have really increased the sophistication of their operation. They're able to much more effectively target the type of information they're encrypting within organizations, meaning that they know the information that they're stealing is actually going to make an impact and something that the organizations are willing to potentially pay for. So that said, we still really want organizations to focus on best practices and fundamentals. So things like ensuring patching is done quickly and repeatedly, making sure you have remote, any kind of remote access has multi-factor authentication, and then also making sure that you have an incident response program and you're testing it so that you can respond much more quickly and effectively when these attacks occur.
How have we seen the profile of these cyber criminals shift? I mean, there's so much attention on a lot of these state-backed hacks. Obviously, names like countries like Iran, as well as Russia and China, often mentioned. To what extent do they make up the profile? How much of this is about individuals really trying to get at the heart of the information?
Yeah, so when we look at the SolarWinds attacks or the Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities, we're really talking about nation state actors who are extremely well funded and very well disciplined and patient, right? You certainly saw that with the SolarWinds attack, months of activity prior to notification to the larger public. So the reality, though, that we see now is that those types of opportunities can then be leveraged by these ransomware attackers. So while the nation state actors may have different objectives, the reality is the ransomware operators have become much more disciplined. We've long talked about these nation state actors having varsity and junior varsity teams that they leverage to do the work and mapping those capabilities to their objectives. The reality is ransomware operators are doing that now extremely effectively. They're outsourcing parts of the operation that they're not as good at. So they're willing to share their profits with people who develop code for them, people who host infrastructure. And the other part of it is that we're no longer talking about just one financial stream. Now it's not just, I'm going to ask you to pay me when I encrypt your data to get it back, but I might also pay you or ask you to pay me, to not ensure that I do reputational damage and name and shame your organization publicly. Or and a third part of it would be that I potentially conduct a DDoS attack against you if you don't pay the money as well. So we're seeing multiple financial streams here being leveraged very effectively that are creating these higher payouts.
Wow. Even cyber criminals getting sophisticated with their pricing models out there. But Wendi Whitmore, Palo Alto Network, Senior Vice President, Cyber Consulting and Threat Intelligence, appreciate you coming on.